Our next session is focused on global privacy. Unfortunately, I just heard recently from Gilbert Nyadeje, who was going to be our third panelist. He is not available right now. He's in Rwanda. But we have Diego Fernandez, who's joining us from Argentina, and Surya Mattu from Brooklyn, and they're going to talk to us today about their expertise, which in both of their cases goes back, over a decade, closer to two, in the tech reporting. In the sense of Surya, he actually is a 2019 National Press Foundation Award recipient for Best Technology Journalism, which I'm sure is, one of his most prized accomplishments. He is a data journalist and also an engineer who works on building tools that investigate algorithms. So he has a lot of expertise here and is really interesting. Diego is the IP, IT, and privacy partner for Marvel, O'Farrell, and Myrtle, a law firm. As I said, he works in Argentina. He also teaches global privacy for John Marshall Law School in Chicago, an online course. And he is joining us and has a hard stop after this to watch his country in the World Cup with his children. So we thank him for fitting us in today. And with that, Surya, I'm going to hand it off to you first.
So nice to meet all of you. I see a couple of familiar faces in there. Now I see two of myself. It's very confusing, but it's fine. I'm a data journalist. I've done a lot of work collecting data for investigating algorithms. I used to work at the Markup, and before that at Gizmodo. I think I saw Mario in the crowd. Hi, for there. And before that, I used to work at ProPublica. So I spent a lot of time basically doing data collection for journalism, a lot of it in the US, some of it in Europe and in other parts of the world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my first project. The first project I want to talk to you about is a project I did the Markup called Citizen Browser. That was a pretty big undertaking to investigate Facebook's recommendation algorithms. And then I want to kind of take this. So the second bit, talk a little bit about my new project called WhatsApp Watch, which I'm doing based out of Princeton University. I'm starting a new lab there. And I'll talk about that in the second bit. So the first thing, I don't know if I can share my screen here, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of Citizen Browser. Let's see if I can do this. So hopefully you can see that. And if you can't, someone please let me know. So Citizen Browser was basically a project I did with the Markup. The Markup, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit newsroom that was based out of New York City originally, but is now national, people all over the country, that uses its tech expertise to do reporting on algorithmic systems. So what we essentially were doing with Citizen Browser was trying to build a crowdsourced panel of users in the US to have them donate their data to us to determine how exactly Facebook was recommending things to the people that use their platform. This is one of those situations where there's a lot of data going around. You can get some of this data through an API. You can get it in different ways, but there's no easy way to independently audit what's happening on the platform. And this was our attempt at doing that as journalists. When you start diving into data-driven investigations, it gets quite interesting. To me, it gets interesting really fast. The first question that always comes up is a question of what is being measured. So, the only tool that exists or existed to monitor what was happening on Facebook was something called CrowdTangle, which I'm sure a lot of you here have used. It's a tool that allowed you to see what was popular on Facebook. But even Facebook's definition of popular was very specific to its own content and its own uses. So I think they defined popularity as what was being seen by the most people, not how often it was being seen by people. And depending on what you're interested in answering as your hypothesis, those are very different questions that can be answered using that data. So one of the reasons we built this whole system was actually to basically come up with our own metrics so that we could truly investigate the platform without being dependent on them for determining what we can and can't measure. So the way we did this was we built a little desktop browser. This was actually work that kind of builds on work I did while I was at Gizmodo, which was when I was there, I worked at Kashmir Hill, and we were looking at Facebook's People You May Know algorithm. I just bring her up because she was the person I won the award with. I kind of just got to be a sidekick to her amazing work. And this was basically kind of building on that work of trying to crowdsource data from Facebook. Basically, what you do is panelists would download this app on their computer. It would essentially, once you log into Facebook through it once, it runs on the background on the computer, and 2 or 3 times a day, it opens up a browser in the background and then just scrolls down and collects all the things that are being shown to the person in the newsfeed, as well as what groups will be recommended to them and what Facebook pages are being recommended to them. In this way, we were able to build an independent data set of what Facebook recommends. There were a lot of privacy concerns, obviously, so everything in pink was being redacted. We didn't take any personal information. We really tied our hands behind our back when we were doing this data collection, just to make sure that the people who were sharing the data with us had clarity about exactly what we're taking, and as well as felt secure about what we were going to do with that data. So, like I said, we got advertisements, links, and posts from groups, public groups. We didn't get anything else. So we didn't get any comments. We didn't get any people's name. We really minimized how much data we were getting for the purposes of the safety and security of the panelists. So this is kind of the essence. We monitored what was amplified to people on their feeds versus what we kind of saw organically. This is summary of the steps. Recruited the panel, set up the browser, collected the data, and reported it out. And I just want to show you a couple of the stories we did with it because I think it gets really interesting. So when you build a whole system like that, this is the kind of reporting it enables you to do. So right after January, before the 2020 elections, Facebook had said that they were no longer going to recommend political groups on their platform. The reason they said that is studies have shown how Facebook groups is one of the ways in which a lot of polarization and polarizing content and misinformation was spreading in the US. And before the elections, to kind of mitigate the effect of that, they said that they would stop recommending political groups. And through Citizen Browser, we found that they actually they didn't stop, they kept doing so. And this is again one of those things. It's like there is no API for this. There is no way to get access to this data without us having built this platform. And this went on all the way to January 6th. After January 6th, we was found that they were still doing it, and then eventually we published our story. Senator Markey wrote them a letter, and then they stopped. It turned out later we found out through the Facebook files that this story actually got escalated all the way to Mark Zuckerberg, and it turned out that there was an engineering issue with how they were caching groups for different users, and they didn't realize that they were actually leaking all of this data. But this is one of the reasons I think it's important to have independent audits and methods to do the kind of data collection we do at the Markup. We did when I was at the Markup and what I'm doing now at Princeton. And the regulatory landscape of that is really tricky. And I think as journalists, there's an interesting kind of intersection between journalism and security research that comes into play here of like kind of really having to have best practices on what we are doing with data so that we are beyond like kind of reputable sources of information when you bring it out to the public. It's because, like all the stuff like this, like Offish technically can be against Facebook's terms of service. They do a lot of stuff in the background to try to make it hard to collect this data. But that's kind of where the tension tends to lie. So we did a bunch of other reporting too. I'm not really going to spend more time on this. If you go to the Markup's website, you can see what it was. But there's a bunch of things around like the different ways in which people were being shown things on Facebook, the way ads were violating policies that they shouldn't have been. Like they were showing credit card ads were targeting people under the age of 18, which you're not allowed to do in the US and things like this. We also ran a panel in Germany and found that Facebook was promoting the right-wing party, AFD, during the elections there. Now the story I'm not going to get into just in the interest of time, but yeah, so that was basically what we did for. Let's see, how do I stop sharing? That's what we did for Citizen browser. And now I'm working, I basically left the markup and I started a new lab called the Digital Witness Lab at Princeton University. And over there, we are basically trying to take the learnings from the markup and my previous work as a data journalist to work in a more international context. The first project we're working on is something called WhatsApp Watch, and it's basically trying to take some of the learnings from the citizen browser and other work we've done collecting data from Facebook and monitoring the spread of misinformation and how media manipulation takes place in countries like India through platforms like WhatsApp. I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer more questions and have a broader discussion about anything I discussed. Thank you.
Okay, Diego, please feel free to start.
Okay, so hi everybody. I can see you now. I see you're wearing masks. It seems that we're going back into that here in Argentina too, unfortunately. So very happy to be with you. As Sam said, I'm from Argentina. It's far away, but I normally visit the US. So I have a chance to interact with journalists from your country. Normally, the type of audience I'm used to be discussing and talking about privacy and data protection is not journalists. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to be here with you today. I have a totally different background compared to Surya. I'm a lawyer, graduated here in Argentina. I studied in the US for some time. I worked in the US for a firm, law firm there. And I'm more on the side, my day-to-day is advising different type of companies, and many of the ones that Surya was mentioning, on how to comply with privacy and data protection, how to do business in the right way. And we provide services here in Argentina, but I also have it's very common that we have to provide services through the region, the Latin American region. So I'm aware of the different regulations that we have around the Latin American region. So the idea was that I give you an overall understanding flavor of what's going on in this part of the world, let's say Latin America as a whole, but Argentina in particular. And so they open to questions you may have about what's going on here. So I would say Argentina and most of the Latin American countries are very related to European countries. Most of us have immigration coming, in the case of Argentina, for example, Spain, France, or Italy, like 100 years ago and even more. And so our system of law, which is a constitutional system, different from the one you have in the US, is very inspired by European regulation. So it's no surprise that we have a constitution that is very similar, actually, to the US Constitution also, but to the European constitutions. And normally, in the different Latin American countries, the right to privacy and the right to data protection are normally constitutional rights. Data protection and privacy, something that, of course, are very well protected in terms of the law. And for example, I'll give you an example. Argentina has a 20-year-old data protection law, which is considered to be very similar to the prior regulation the EU had. So I would say different to the US, where you have sectorial laws, for example, HIPAA applying to when you have to health institutions, or you have different regulations sectorial apply to finance institutions of banking activities, or etc. Here in Latin America, we normally have a general law applicable to all sectors and industries, and also applying to private and public sector in the same way. That takes us to a different something I want to mention, which is Convention 108. There's only one, I would say only one international instrument, or it's not a treaty, it's a convention actually, drafted by the Europeans. Just Convention 108 is an old instrument setting a level of protection for personal data. And there's a modernized version of the same convention, which is Convention 108 Plus. And so what we are seeing here in Latin America is that most of the countries are either updating their laws, that are like the case in Argentina, or they are enacting for the first time a data protection law, which is very similar to GDPR in the EU, or they are also adhering to being a party to these conventions and also respecting some of these fundamental rights. In terms of, it might be interesting to you about enforcement and awareness. So in terms of enforcement, I would say that except for some countries like Brazil or Colombia, enforcement of data protection laws is not very high in the region. In some cases, because of course, because of the resources, the data protection authority doesn't have enough resources, human and economic, both. In other cases, because the sanctions are very low, so there's no deterrent to be compliant with the law, and that's of course something we have been working for a long time. For example, Argentina is updating its law, and we are gonna, if it's passed, we're gonna have very high sanctions in terms of monetary sanctions, up to 70 million or 2 to 4% of the global turnover of a company, which can be a lot of money. And also in terms of the enforcement by the consumers or the data subject, also it's very low. It's not very common here, for example, in Argentina, that someone go to the data protection authority and files a claim because any company, you name it, a big tech company is not complying with their privacy policy, or they are processing the data without consent, or they are sharing the data with someone they didn't ask for, etc. And in terms of awareness, it was very interesting to hear from Surya the reports and the cases he's working on, because here awareness is very low also. But we have seen, and it started to appear, these kind of reports, like civil rights organizations preparing reports on the privacy policy of the big tech company or the telecom companies, and they are starting to analyze what their privacy policy says, what people are actually asked to consent to, and of course what they really do in the market. And then the report comes out, and of course no one wants to be there listed with a very low grade. They're all very international large companies that have a reputation that they want to take care of. And so I think the work you are doing, Surya, and talking generally, the work that these kind of organizations are doing, it's sometimes it's even better than having the protective law, having the sanction. Putting companies in the spotlight sometimes it's better as a deterrent than other kind of proceedings. So that's in general an overview in a nutshell what I see going on in Latin America. I can also say, and because I understand that most of you are journalists, if not all, that the source of journalists are protected under the data protection law in a meaning that you can claim as a journalist the confidential basis of your source. And so data protection law does not apply. If someone wants to, for example, access your databases with the data that you have, because they have a right to access the data, that the right of the journalist to protect their sources is above the right of the data subject to know what you have. So I do think freedom of speech in the region has always been a huge, very protected matter. The Argentine Supreme Court has excellent precedents, I would say, similar to some of the ones you have in the Supreme Court of the US, protecting the sources, protecting the free speech, protecting the possibility of journalists to write whatever they want without being asked more than taking serious steps to try to confirm that the data they are publishing is true. And the data protection laws are not the exceptions. They are, of course, they protect data subjects, but the sources of the journalists are also well protected. So with that, Anne, I pass it back to you, and I'm open, as Surya said, to discuss and have questions with the audience.
I'm definitely rooting for Argentina for the World Cup, Diego. So get your act together, Messi. But my question is for Surya. Surya, I'm really curious to hear more about your research on misinformation on WhatsApp. And I guess I have a personal stake because I'm on several large WhatsApp groups with extended family and friends in India. And yes, misinformation galore there seems to be no control on anything. I've always thought of it as kind of ridiculous, but over COVID, it took a downright dangerous turn with a lot of health misinformation. And so I'm just curious to hear what you're looking at and what your goal is in terms of, is it to make the users more aware of the issues, or to put accountability on the companies, or just if you could tell us more, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the joke I make is that so like data journalism is like a word that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So when I started working as a data journalist, it was a lot of data visualization. Before that, it used to be far more around analysis. Like computer-assisted researchers are what we actually used to call data journalists back in the 80s and 90s. And what I basically have learned that I do is data collection. So the joke I like to make when I'm explaining what I do to people is I'm kind of like a photojournalist in algorithm city, trying to take pictures of like what's happening within an algorithmic system so that we can kind of witness in reality what that looks like. So the goal is always, there's always like a tech accountability angle of like trying to hold companies accountable for what they claim happens on their platform versus what happens on their platform. With Facebook, it's one thing because it's clearly like recommendation algorithms that they're using. Can I not see my face? It'd be nice to see the audience. I keep seeing myself twice, and it's kind of hard to have a conversation with someone like that. So I don't know if there's something I can do to stop that. But if you can help, that'd be great. But so that is back to WhatsApp. The goal is really to find. So when I say this photo, this is why the lab's also called the Digital Witness Lab. The goal is to find real anecdotes of like what this looks like. Like people have like this general sense of what misinformation feels like and how it spreads, but our focus is really to find the people behind it and find specific kind of media manipulation techniques or specific harassment campaigns, so that like when my mom is using WhatsApp and gets all these messages coming in, we have like concrete signals which we can measure. Like for example, what happens on WhatsApp right now a lot is like you have these like fact-checking tip lines, right, that are run by news organizations that you can like forward a message to. What we're trying to do is actually work with journalists on the ground to collect data from political party WhatsApp groups, from public WhatsApp groups, to persistently monitor what's happening and see the effect it has, and then make that available to someone so that like when my mom gets a message on WhatsApp, she can be more aware of like who might have created that message and for what purpose. That was like a long rambling way to say the two focuses of our analysis at the moment are media manipulation techniques that are used by political parties and other powerful actors, and harassment campaigns that are targeting individuals who might be pissing the wrong people off.
I'm really curious about how you are analyzing data from one-to-one messages, or like how people opt in to give you this data. Not in the sense of like, what's anonymized or not that at all. I just think like tracking dis and misinformation on messaging platforms seems so much more difficult than a one-to-many platform, and I just don't necessarily understand how you're going about that.
It's hard, and it's not one thing. It's kind of like you should think of it as like a composition of a bunch of different things. It's not like there's one particular strategy. It's like, for example, I've seen in India there's a particular there's a couple of techniques that people tend to use that have been reported on. Like one of the techniques you've seen is the use of Google Docs spread across WhatsApp groups to manipulate hashtags on Twitter and other social media platforms. So looking for these Google Docs in public WhatsApp groups and seeing if we can find the text from these groups on platforms like Twitter and this is where the engineering comes in, right? Is you build the system that actually kind of measures for this, so that when I'm working with a journalist on the ground, we can test it quickly, see if this is actually happening or not. Similarly, in Brazil, for example, versus India, there was a lot, especially these recent elections, there was a lot more use of websites, what they call pink slime websites, where there's a lot of like kind of, misinformation and disinformation from all like political parties across the spectrum, right? It's not like it's only Bolsonaro side who does it, or it's only Lula side. It's become a messy terrain. But over there, they use a lot more of these websites that have this content that they then monetize through ads. So that's another technique. So basically working with people who are on the ground to get a sense of what the reporting looks like, and then seeing where we can use our tools to monitor those signals is the approach we're taking. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, if you want an end product idea, I made a tool at the Markup called Blacklight, which is a real-time website privacy inspector. When we started building Blacklight, I didn't know what a real-time website privacy inspector was, but it ended up being a set of 8 tests that we could easily, clearly measure precisely on the internet. It's not all the things that are like all the privacy violations that are happening, but given the constraints we had, it was the ones that we could accurately measure that people could then use for their own research and reporting. So it's a similar idea, is to work with journalists so starting in India, we're also talking to people in Brazil, and we're also talking to people in Kenya. And just seeing what's actually like, what are the different organic strategies that are coming up on the ground? What can we do to measure them, and how do we make that information easy for journalists to access so they can use it for reporting, so that we can kind of show the Wizard of Oz, peel the curtain back so that people have a better sense of like the humans that are behind these systems, not just the algorithms.
Hi, I had a question for Diego. So in the US, a lot of the data privacy debate this year has started intersecting with data related to reproductive health after the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And I was just kind of curious if that has been a concern at all in Latin America. I know that it's very different. Argentina launched the Green Wave, which is kind of the opposite direction of where we are in the US, but there are countries like Nicaragua and El Salvador, which are very different. And is any of the negotiations on data privacy connect with reproductive health at all in Latin America that you've seen?
Okay, so don't leave the mic, because I might re-ask you if I'm understanding correctly the question. So are you referring to health data or specifically reproductive?
Thinking reproductive health has been a concern in the US, if it was health data related to anything in the reproductive health spectrum.
Well, yeah, in Argentina, and most Latin American countries, the definition of health data is very, very broad. So reproductive health data, of course, is health data. And the difference between what we call general personal data and health data is that no one can be actually obliged to provide that kind of data. So, of course, if I go to a clinic and I want to go through some kind of treatment, of course, I have to give them access to that data. Otherwise, they cannot comply with their part of the contract. But there has not been such a debate. Health data is very well regulated as sensitive data. You have to have in place many security measures around that, and of course, who can have access to it's very limited. I would say that to give you a flavor of what's going on here, and Argentina is, for example, during COVID, during the pandemic, Argentina was one of the countries which had in place most of the clinical trials for the approval of the different COVID vaccines. So there's an ecosystem here of health data related industry, which is actually very good, I would say, in terms of being able to protect data of the data subjects when it comes to health, and then, of course, promote and be able to do business. So I wouldn't say there's such a debate. There are more debates about reproductive health data when it comes to regulations that clashes with religion, I would say. Abortion rights and that kind of things are Latin American countries. Of course, they were colonized by the Spanish in many cases, and the church was here before we were here, and so most of the countries are very Catholic, I would say, and that clashes a lot with the rights of data subjects. I hope I'm answering that.
Yeah.
Hi, Diego. You said that enforcement is light. Awareness among the population is also low right now. How does that affect the posture of companies with regards to how much they pay attention to privacy, whether they're willing to sort of forego investment into that, how much, they invest in your services, for example. What does that tell us about, and, as there's more attention paid to it, does that posture change over time?
Well, that was an excellent question. Of course, when it happens to me a lot, when a company asks, say that you have a U.S. company starting business in Buenos Aires, and they ask you, what do we have to do? Well, you have to set the company, then you have to hire someone. These are the taxes they're going to pay, and this is how labor law works, etc., etc. Of course, you tell them what they have to do with data protection, how you have to register your databases, etc. And of course, there are smart guys there asking, what if not? So what if I'm not complying with data protection law? And so you get to the fines section, and fines are very low, even lower than paying me, as you said. So that is a very difficult thing to do. My experience over I would say the last 20 years is that we already passed that stage of, because the fines are very low, we're not going to comply with the law. We're way past that. In many cases, because companies are international companies, they cannot do that in Argentina, but then be compliant in the US. There's like a whole image that is only one. There's a unity of what the company is, and the company cannot be one in Argentina and one different in Brazil. But then some other things came up, and it's related what we are talking today, and that's cybersecurity, that's security incidents. So most of the times where you're not complying with data protection laws, from a security standpoint, security incidents are more common to happen. And that's where companies don't want to be, because that's a complete mess. One thing is not to have the consent of a data subject to process the data, and one other difference is to your database being leaked all over the internet. And so that allowed the conversation on cybersecurity, allowed privacy and data protection to all the way up to the CEO of the board. And so now we sit with the CEO or the board members, and we discuss privacy, and they have understood, and that's something that I think is very positive. And maybe you see the same in the US. Companies have started to see, and I think the example of that in the US is Apple. They started to see that if you protect the privacy and the personal data of your clients, your users, your whatever you want to call them, there's a benefit, and that benefit goes to the pocket of the company. And so they not only comply because they have to comply, and even if they don't want to comply because of that, but because they see a benefit, a tangible benefit, economical benefit at the end of the day. And so many tech companies here in Argentina, some of them are local companies that started here, but they are a step forward in saying, if we comply, it's good for the business. And so they're starting to be, and maybe Surya knows more about that, they're starting to be metrics of the return of the investment when you protect privacy and personal data of your clients in the company in general, in their turnover at the end of the year. So that would be where I think most companies are. And I'm talking about Argentina. That could be the same in some other countries like Brazil or some big markets like Mexico. It's not the case in some other countries. Every country has different culture and difficulties. But that's something I'm seeing over the years, and I think we are doing a lot of progress there.
In terms of designing the systems, a lot of the big tech firms, Facebook, for example, have been dinged for their ability to adapt their, with regards to content moderation, their tools and services to foreign countries. In terms of designing privacy regimes and tools and informing customers in other languages and cultures that may have different standards, are there, is that taken into account, and, is there work to be done there?
That's another good question. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name to just name you. Of course, the different cultures, most of the tech companies or yeah, most of the tech companies are originated in the US. And so, of course, they have a US flavor. They have a different culture, different language, different thresholds, different reactions to. It's different sometimes how you see free. I come from an IP perspective also. I'm a trademark lawyer. So the free speech when it comes to, for example, comparative advertising, it's in the US you can say and do much more than what you can do in Latin American countries, for example. So they did have to adapt their practices to different markets. I would say no, anyhow, I would say that cultures are more in Latin America. I'm not talking about Asia or other countries that could be different, but culture is not that different from the US to Argentina in certain aspects. So aside from the language, of course, and the different regulations, they have to adapt a little bit. What I've seen, my experience with my clients is that you have two choices, or you either have a specific practice for a different jurisdiction. So you say this is gonna happen for Argentine users of a platform, Facebook platform, or you go into what is a middle ground, like a harmonization level across the region that would make me compliant in the different jurisdictions. Even if there are some specific things, of course, I cannot comply with every specific provision of every law. And I think that's probably what I see the most. And I come from, I participate in different organizations. I just came from Brussels for the AIPP meeting. And many panels were dealing with that. How do you deal with a company doing business everywhere? So how you adapt because at the end of the day, the systems that you have and where you process all the data, it's not that easy to segregate. This is Argentina, this is Mexico, this is the US. Everything comes in a similar bucket, and so it's better for them to find a middle ground where they can do business, and with that live with there are certain risks, of course, and they're willing to run. That, for example, the Mexican Data Protection Authority said that you are missing, this word in your form, but they are nothing compared to complying with most of the general principles. That's what I see normally.
And I just add to that, I think depending on the country, you often have the flip side, which is governments want access to data that otherwise, they want the ability to go into your databases and then pull out whatever they want for their own purposes, which then adds another layer of complication to all the stuff Diego is saying, right? So I know, for example, in India, they have these basically hostage employees in the country, where they are essentially people on the ground who are responsible for communicating or liaising with the government. And if they have an end-to-end encrypted system or something where they're not actually able to give access to data, that's the person they kind of catch as the way to assert power. So I think that adds another kind of layer of complexity to the privacy conversation as well.
This sort of builds on that, but how concerned and either of you can answer it, but how concerned are you about, I guess, more data security than privacy, but for platforms that are, owned outside the US, like TikTok as an example?
I can start with that. I think it's different threat models for different companies, but fundamentally, I don't see much of. Just in whatever analysis I've seen so far of TikTok versus Facebook, or Apple even. Apple behaves differently in China than it does in the US, right? So I think a famous example that's come up recently is Apple's AirDrop facility in China only works for 10 seconds. It doesn't, because it's one of the ways in which a lot of information is disseminated during protests. So I think there's a company angle, but there's also just a way the company deals with whichever government they're talking to. But the first part of your question, I think, is really interesting, especially from a journalism perspective, is the difference between data privacy and data breaches and infrastructure. Because I think a lot of stuff, something that I've seen, something I say a lot with all of my colleagues in journalism is we have to find ways to tell data stories that give readers a sense of agency, not apathy around the role technology play in their life. It's really easy to make the tech companies seem like these larger than life, panopticon, like, all seeing, all knowing entities. But the reality is they don't really know what to do with that stuff. They are just optimizing for an economic function, which is their focus. And then all of this is kind of like the stuff you deal with as a byproduct of that. So I think the role of journalism is to often show that, like, hey, it's dumb. It's not as smart. They're not like using best practices. And that's like, what Diego was saying earlier. I think that is a role that journalism can play, is come to someone like Diego and say, hey, they wrote a bad story about these people. So I want to make sure that doesn't happen to us. And I think with tech companies, this global context is really important because it's very, it's easier for them if you silo like what Facebook is doing in the US versus what Facebook is doing in Myanmar, or what TikTok is doing in China versus Singapore or whatever. But I think like a big part of the conversation here is actually figuring out how to do these global kind of reporting stories. And I draw a lot of inspiration from like ICIJ and like, the Panama and Pandora papers and things like that. And I think we need a similar model for tech reporting.
And then just a quick practical question. Surya, are any of your projects or like, do you have any tools or data sets that the journalists in this room could access as an example?
I don't, but the markup has a bunch depending on your subject matter of interest. But also, like, if you have particular interests, reach out to me, and I'm happy to see if there's anyone I know who might.
Hi, this question is for Diego. I was curious to get your thoughts, Diego, on the situation with the Argentina Ministry of Education authorizing the use of educational tech websites for children during the pandemic, which was later found to be surveilling children and passing on information to Facebook and Google, I believe it was.
Well, yeah, I would start saying that as far as I know, that has not been proved in court. So they were denounces and there were claims filed regarding that, but we haven't seen a decision on the merits of whether they were doing what they were saying they were doing. So with that caveat, of course, my comment would only be, I don't see to be a good practice, of course, to be surveilling children anywhere in the world. Of course, that's not what we expect from our governments, and of course, we have to put in place systems that will help us identify when that's happening. So there are certain tools, and I've seen in different countries around the world that some of the software that are being used by certain, like the state of the Ministry of Education that we were saying, they have to be somehow able to be audited, either because you provide a source code or either because you program them on open source. But at the end of the day, you have to give the general public, because they are serving a greater good, as we said, and it's a good practice to have the ability to be able to see how they work and what they do. The same that you were mentioning happened with security incidents with most of the information regarding our passports, and they appear online. Or there was, during the pandemic, there was an app that's still active. It's called My Argentina, that they had all the information and the permits to be on the street, etc. And no one could, except for those who have access to it, no one could actually see whether there were any backdoors, whether the app was connecting with any third parties, whether GPS location of the different citizens were given to the app, even if it says no. That's part of what I'm saying when I talk about the reports that Surya was mentioning at the beginning. Everything has to be somehow auditable so that we have a better flavor and sense of what's going on with our data. But as long as I know, there's not that obligation to the government to do that. So that would be my comment.
I'd add one thing to that, which is just to Diego's point. Apple in iOS 15 introduced this new feature called the App Privacy Report, where they essentially let you see what different apps are doing on your phone. So when they're accessing the microphone, when they're accessing the camera, when they're accessing your location, all the network requests they're making. And that's just an iOS level setting. So kind of to Diego's point, I love stuff like that because it means that it cuts my work down by half. Because normally I would have to first hack an operating system of an Android phone to get access to that level of data and then be able to see. But if Apple gives us access to that information easily, it means that like kind of the story you were just talking about in Argentina, you can audit it yourself. You can see what's happening, and if no one's answering to you, you can send it to a tech journalist and say, "Hey, I just use this app and look at this thing." And I think that could actually be a good mechanism for preventing some of this stuff. But the app privacy report is something I would encourage you looking up if you're interested in that.
Hi. So I was wondering if either of you could speak about how companies approach the different, like complying with the different regulatory actions that arise from different companies when they have data servers in multiple countries where the regulations or laws around data privacy and security may differ. I guess I'm wondering, what do they defer to in those situations, and how do they deal with all of those different regulations across different companies when they're kind of moving their data around the world?
Do I start, Surya? Okay. So that question has I think, two-part answer. The first one is something I already talked a little bit about, that they have to choose when they have different regulations and those regulations are not the same. They have to choose either to comply with each of them separately or look for a middle ground and comply them all with a unique standard. But the other part, so most regulations around the world, when you have different servers, that means that data is going from one country to the other. It's difficult to think that you will be collecting data in the US, but that data will not leave the US servers. Somehow, sometime, you either go to India because they have very good programmers, or you go to Argentina because you have the development team there, etc. So what the regulations have built on are safeguards. So some of the countries are called adequate countries because they provide a level of protection that is the same level or similar to the one you have in the country where the data is originated. If it doesn't have that, you normally resort to what is called contractual clauses. So you have to have an agreement between the data exporter and the data importer, which basically elevates the level of protection by a contract and makes the importer in the foreign country be subject to the regulations of the exporter country and data protection in that other country, and even the courts. So those are the way companies navigate. And I'm working at this time I'm working with many, for example, fintech companies. It is just amazing how many processors and sub-processors you have in a fintech company all around the world. You can have 100. So you need 100 contracts. You have to manage the contracts. You have to sign them in. You have to see the different jurisdictions. You have to see if there's any regulatory aspect in any of those countries that will prevent you from sending data to that country. And you, of course, as journalists, know the Schrems cases with the US. And so going back to the other question, the access to personal data by the governments for whatever reasons, be it security, national defense, etc., is another thing that you have to very thoroughly analyze when you are having these very complex relations between data processors around the world. But that's, in my opinion and my experience, how they deal with it.
Surya, this question is for you. I was wondering, just in general, if you kind of had any opinion or viewpoint on, I guess, any apps or other newer platforms that kind of catch your attention as far as like popular sort of platforms for use, but also misinformation. I mean, granted, yes, Facebook is still sort of a big one, but I always also hear that fewer and fewer people are using it. Fewer people are on it. And TikTok has already been brought up, but I'm wondering if there are any other platforms or spaces you're watching in this regard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm currently focusing a lot of my energy on WhatsApp because like WhatsApp is a good way into this peer-to-peer model of communication, which I think can translate to Telegram and Signal or any it's like a different. It's not a recommendation system. I think that's important to look at. I know in India, for example, there's a lot of these like social networks as a service kind of platforms coming up now, where there's like something called Share Chat and some other smaller ones. But I try to look at them from the perspective of an investigation. I'm trying to see I try to build a hypothesis that I'm trying to answer and then kind of go backwards. I saw this is this is a tangent one of the places that I think is really undercovered right now is fitness trackers. And I know there are lots of people in this room are probably interested in that space, but I remember like 5 or 6 years ago, before I started working as a journalist, I also work as an artist and make art projects critiquing technologies. And I made this project called Unfitbits, just basically a critique of fitness trackers being used by life insurance companies, requiring you to use a fitness tracker to get a discount. It used to be like kind of a way to get a discount on your insurance premium. And now companies like John Hancock, at least last I checked, were requiring people with life insurance to have a fitness tracker to get like the lower tier price. And let me see if I can share this with you. I saw a mind-boggling research study yesterday. Let me see if I can share this with my screen with you, because this blew my mind. Can you see this flowchart that I'm sharing? This is from a study, and I'll send you the link of all the different types of data you can get from an accelerometer on a mobile device. An accelerometer is basically the thing that measures motion on your phone. So when you shake it or whatever, the accelerometer is essentially what a fitness tracker has. And these are all the different types of data that are available to people who have access, signals that are available to people who have access to that data. So I just bring that up because I think, we spend a lot of time in this misinformation space, which I think is an important one from one particular aspect, but there's all of these other sensors, that exist that we are not paying attention to, that are equally or worse in a way. The power of the insurance industry to have access to that data, to me, is as powerful as Google having all of our searches.
Sorry, just a follow-up to that. I wasn't going to ask, but just because that was really interesting. I think one thing, I came to this fellowship to ask more questions around the health information collected on your Apple Watch or whatever. And one thing I struggle with is for mis and disinformation, there's a lot more quantifiable impact of what the spread of that misinformation causes in real life, whereas I have less of a tangible understanding of how the information you're sharing on your smartwatch then affects your life, besides insurance companies, which can be really rote and thick and hard to. I just am curious, what you see as the impact there, besides insurance rates, which can cause readers' eyes to kind of glaze over.
Acceleration as a proxy for health is a problematic space. So when you're taking something that can measure motion and then you're basically using it's a reductive signal, right? It can only really measure how something is moving, but it can't measure all these other signals for health. And when you start using those as the baseline for what is considered to be a healthy person, suddenly a lot of people are going to get marginalized who up till now were not being marginalized because there wasn't this metric to measure them against. And then you start looking at some of the research around the sensors and how they're used. The joke I always like to make about fitness trackers is they work kind of like astrology. They work really well to help you help yourself, but they don't work so well if you're trying to use them as a raw piece of evidence in a court of law. They're not as scientific as people claim. They're quite heuristics driven. But more and more as they get normalized in our world, people start treating them to be kind of these baseline truths. So finding all the ways in which these outliers of who gets left behind, who doesn't fit into the the middle of the bell curve of who these systems are designed for, I think can have a lot of powerful impact. And just to give you a sense of where that's coming from. Like when I was at ProPublica and we were doing a lot of Facebook stuff, back then we were looking at all these Facebook ads. It was 2015, no one cared. They were like, who cares? This is not interesting. And we were able to show back then that Facebook was enabling digital redlining, which was like, selling ads for people who wanted to buy a home, but excluding people who were had an ethnic affinity to African American or Hispanic or Asian American. And even though we didn't have a concrete example of someone buying that ad, the fact that that platform was enabling that, even though they said they weren't doing stuff like that, it's stories like that, I think, is where the power lies with stuff like this. It's like thinking basically about who was left out of the room when the system was being designed, and how is this system going to burden them in their lives in a way that they are now going to have to answer to another algorithm. DNA is another example of this, right? Like DNA is being used by cops as a way to track people and identify people. Like there's been a lot of reporting that's shown that some of the software that's been used to identify DNA doesn't actually work as well as they said it does, and things like that. So it's that same kind of idea. I hope that helps answer the question. I kind of rambled there, sorry.